Good afternoon, everyone. This is Amy Dacey with the Sine Institute of Policy and Politics at American University. We're just a mere day away from people in person voting on Election Day 2020. And we've pulled together an amazing group of individuals with us today to help us navigate some of the most pressing questions about the election administration and what will be happening in the days to come. First of all, I want to give a huge thank you to the Washington College of Law and Government program headed by Fernando Lagarda, who's one of our co-sponsors, the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies with David Barker, and also the Women in Politics Institute with Betsy Fisher Martin. All have contributed and pulled together to put a great event for you here today. I'm excited to share with you all of our incredible panelists. First, I want to start with Erin Martin, who serves as Policy Counsel for the Public Policy Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, where she advocates for the advancement and protection of civil rights at the federal level. We're so glad that you're here with us today, Erin. And Kim Will, who is a full-time professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law, specializing in the respective powers of the three branches of federal government. In addition to her work for broad audiences, she continues to write scholarly articles for top law reviews across the country. She is also the author of What You Need to Know About Voting and Why, which is especially why we want to talk to her today. And the Sine Institute will be providing information about the book and where you can get it. And we certainly hope that you follow up after this by purchasing the book. We also will be having Ben Ginsburg joining us. He's a nationally known political law advocate for 38 years. His experience is representing participants in the political process. And his clients have included political parties, political campaigns, candidates, members of Congress and state legislators, governors, corporations, trade associations, PACs, vendors, donors, individuals. He's represented 4 of the last 6 Republican presidential nominees. Ben is no newcomer to what it feels like the days before election. Bob Bauer was going to join us, who is also was White House counsel for President Obama and has certainly been working on these elections, these last few presidential elections. And so he also was pulled away, but we certainly encourage you. He has a book called After Trump that we'll also be sharing with the network and has a lot of information on this. But now I'd like to hand it over to our amazing moderator for today. Louis Caldara is a distinguished adjunct professor of law and a senior affiliate in the program on law and governing at American University's Washington College of Law. He has served in numerous public services, higher education, and nonprofit leadership roles, including as an Army officer, state legislator, university president, and in 2 presidential administrations. He served as Secretary of the Army during the Clinton administration and in the Obama White House as the assistant to the president and director of the White House Military Office. Louis, thank you so much for moderating this incredible group of panelists, and I leave it up to you.
Amy, thank you so much for having me today. Thank you to everybody who has joined us for this discussion. We're going to try to make it a really lively discussion, try to keep it moving quickly with some brief thoughts and answers from our panelists on the different topics. A historic election, a lot on the line. People have been voting across the country in record numbers. So, you know, we want to talk about the things that have come prior to this moment in time. Over the last several weeks, many election law issues and strategic moves by the parties and candidates that we want to get to. We want to talk about what's going to happen during the election, some of the kinds of issues that can come up on election day. And then we're going to talk about what happens after the election with the process that then occurs, counting votes, certifying results, the electoral process, the peaceful transfer of power, if that is what the ultimate will of the voters is. We're going to be a little bit flexible because we lost one of our distinguished panelists, Bob Bauer. That can happen at times like this when people like himself and Ben Ginsburg are in high demand by their clients and others. So we'll be flexible. Ben Ginsburg is going to be joining us in progress. We look forward to having him here. So we will, we'll just roll with it as we can. So I'm going to start by asking the panelists who we have here to just make a few brief introductory remarks, just kind of to set the stage for us because there is so much still to come with this election. And so I want to know what's topmost as your mind as you reflect on the back on the eve of the final day to vote after a long historic election campaign that was conducted in the midst of a pandemic. We haven't had a global pandemic in 100 years. And it very much changed the way people think about the election and the process of registering and casting votes and what changes they might make. So as individuals who've been deeply engaged in this election, if you would share with us, first of all, just 2 to 3 minutes of your topmost thoughts, and then we'll get into some specific questions. And so I see that Ben Ginsburg has joined us. Ben, would you start us off, please?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So we're in sort of historic times with this election. We're in the midst of a pandemic. The country is really historically polarized. We've had racial unrest and threats of civil unrest. And perhaps more than anything else, we've had for the first time a president who has used rhetoric about our elections being rigged and how there's fraud involved, and the only way he can lose is to cheat. And that puts strains on our sort of most core democratic systems that we've not really seen before. And as we go into election day, of course, all of that foreshadows the issue of whether individual voters will have their ballots being challenged, whether situations like is unfolding today in a federal district court down in Houston will result in the disenfranchisement of over 100,000 voters. These are all different sorts of issues that we've had to face before and certainly bear watching.
Thank you very much for framing those very, very important issues that are at stake as we talk about people's fundamental right to vote, the fundamental right of citizens to participate in their democracy. Aaron, would you give us your perspective?
Sure, I'm happy to. And thank you again for inviting me and the Lawyers Committee to speak on this panel. So I think what's been top of mind this year, kind of in light of everything that Ben was just sharing, is just how critical and valuable it is for voters to have a plan to vote and know how they're going to cast their ballot, especially as so many things have been changing this year. It's been unprecedented in many ways as the public has had to constantly adapt to a new way of life with the COVID-19 pandemic, including access to the ballot and the polls. So the Lawyers Committee, as many people know, leads the nonpartisan election protection hotline 866-OUR-VOTE. And this enables us to empower and prepare eligible voters to vote in the election. And we normally have about 5,000 legal volunteers, but this year we've had 23,000 volunteers working night and day to handle the influx of calls that we've received from voters seeking information about how to register, how to cast their absentee ballots, how to vote by mail, polling locations, and other questions so they can safely exercise their right to vote during this pandemic. And just because the federal elections are administered through the states and each state has their own method and their own deadlines, it's very important for voters to have that plan in place so they know how to actually exercise their right to vote. We've seen, due to the pandemic and the increased access to early voting, that 93 million people have already cast their ballots in this election, which is 2/3 of the ballots that were cast in 2016. And we are also seeing a rise in voter suppression and voter intimidation tactics, which I know we'll discuss a little bit later, but we're also seeing the American public engaged with the plan and committed to vote.
The voter intimidation, voter suppression, disinformation, these are all issues that have not been as prominent in our electoral process in the past, but as Ben reminded us, it's a very polarized time that we live in, that we are living in. And to a certain extent, the president's rhetoric has contributed to that, increasing that polarization and some of those actions on the part of his supporters, to be quite frank. Let's turn to Kim Whaley, Professor Whaley, if you'll give us your introductory thoughts.
Yes, well, thank you, Professor Caldara. So great to be here. I miss my friends at WCL. I visited last semester, taught a class on democracy at risk, And I think there are a couple things to keep in mind, in particular with this election. One is that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that democracy itself is on the ballot tomorrow and has been on the ballot through this election season, essentially. And we saw this through the Mueller investigation, the impeachment process, in which there wasn't a meaningful trial held in the Senate. And then the Senate essentially acquitted the president, not just on abuse of power, but also on obstruction of Congress, suggesting that the powers of the legislature have really been handed over to the office of the presidency. And as other constitutional professors and scholars will demonstrate, there's, there are checks and balances, of course. And if you tick off the list of ways of checking the presidency, we've seen them really rapidly go by the wayside over the past few years. And, as you know, last year I wrote a book called How to Read the Constitution and Why, aimed at basic civic literacy. Only 6 states in the country actually require it as a measure, as part of a high school diploma. The Annenberg Center has done a study. A third of Americans cannot even name all 3 branches of government. And so the structure itself, holding people, elected officials accountable at the ballot box, or creating basically an imperial presidency tolerating unlimited power, unlimited, as I say, running through the stop signs, is absolutely critical. So that's number one. Number two, pandemic, the good and the bad news. The bad news, of course, is that we've seen the DMVs closed early in the pandemic, so registration was down. We've had a lot of stress and anxiety around how to vote during this process, changes across the country, and as was indicated, frankly, Republicans consistently challenging greater access to the polls, and in some instances, the Supreme Court not holding up the right to vote over administrative claims of needing to have, for example, a black and white deadline. That being said, I think the silver lining is, as we are seeing Americans really engage in the voting process and learn about the voting process. I mean, I have a piece running tomorrow in the Atlantic. I spoke with Jamie Raskin, also an alum of WCL, about how this president we can expect tomorrow will impose a Cinderella rule that all of a sudden at midnight, the stroke of midnight, we don't even count ballots, regardless of whether they're challenged, only ballots that were actually counted, not even cast by midnight. So people are learning. They're learning that mail-in voting is safe. They're learning that your right to vote depends on your zip code. And we're going to see tomorrow that they're learning that it takes time, in a pandemic in particular, to count millions and millions of ballots. And at the end of the day, it is democracy by we the people, not democracy by we the Republicans, we the Democrats, or we the politicians. And I'm hoping that sentiment, that desire to really learn and engage in democracy, carries over past tomorrow, as well as January 20th, when the new president takes office.
Well, we can all hope that your sense of optimism and certainly your faith in the American people, I think we all believe in that, but that we can learn something from this election. You mentioned the piece that you had, we'll have tomorrow in the Atlantic. We look forward to reading that. I put in our chat a piece that Ben Ginsburg had published today in the Washington Post titled "My Party is Destroying Itself on the Altar of Trump." And I encourage everyone who's watching to read that because it's a very thoughtful piece about some of these very issues that we're discussing, and maybe he'll comment on it. So let's talk first of all about 2 really important parts that have come heretofore, particularly in the context of pandemic. And just to lay the groundwork, of course, we first note that although we have a fundamental right to vote, that right is not explicitly in the Constitution. Therefore, it is sometimes not supported by the courts in their rulings the same way that other fundamental rights that we have are supported. That is, with, as Lori, you would call it a strict scrutiny type test. Instead, there's often a reasonableness type test when looking at state regulations of voting, because states do have to be able to regulate votes because they run elections. And we also note that elections are run under state law, even federal elections, and that state law varies. And this is part of the reason why you have such a great difference about what does it take to register, who can vote by mail, when do those ballots have to be postmarked, et cetera. 2 items that have really been in the news recently are mail-in ballots and drop-off boxes, where ballot drop-off boxes where individuals could drop off those ballots if they lacked confidence that the post office might not deliver their mail-in ballot on time. So there were issues around mail-in ballots, such as who can get them. Is it a liberal regime for mail-in ballots? Will all voters get mail-in ballots, or can only some people vote absentee in that particular state? And then there were questions because we could see that historic numbers of people requested mail-in ballots so that they didn't have to expose themselves to the risks of the pandemic that might come from voting in person, that states started to ask questions about when should those ballots be received in order to be counted, to be considered a valid ballot. And the kind of discussion we've already had about the president saying we should know the decision on election night, when in fact, in many states, the requirement is simply that the ballot be postmarked by election day, and many days, varying number of days are given afterwards for receipt of those ballots, including, I would note, military voters, who often are voting from overseas and almost by definition have to vote by mail. And how much time are we going to allow? Does state law provide for? In some cases, it's courts that are deciding or entering into agreements that based on a protection of the right to vote, that perhaps more time would be allowed for them to receive than legislators, lawyers, others challenging those decisions. Two very, very important topics, and let me just turn that, with that setup, over to our panel to address either of those or both, mail-in voting and ballot drop-off boxes and the issues that have come up around them. And let me ask, by the way, that if you're watching this and you're tweeting about any of the comments that are being made, would you please use the hashtag SPA Live, and that way we'll be able to keep track of the discussion. And Ben, let me again turn it over to you first.
Sure, thank you. Well, I think we should think about drop boxes and mail-in voting and sort of as very separate issues. I think drop boxes are a pretty unassailable item for convenience of the voters. I think there are minimal safety concerns that are legitimate that should be met. The ballots should be in a well-lit area. There should be security cameras on the drop box. I think localities have a responsibility to pick up ballots from drop boxes on a regular basis, probably twice a day, so they're not just lying around. But drop boxes are something, especially in a time of the pandemic, that I think there's no reason not to embrace to let voters vote more conveniently. I think mail-in ballots present a different sort of an issue and should be looked at through a different framework. Obviously, states have a great deal of leeway in what they can allow for their absentee ballots. You're seeing a couple of things. First of all, there's been a great deal of discussion about deadlines. A deadline is a deadline. So if people are going to procrastinate in sending in an absentee ballot, they're probably going to miss the deadline, whether it's election day, 3 days after, or 2 weeks after. There is a counter argument to extending the absentee ballot deadline, which is you really don't want uncertainty to be able to be sort of a petri dish for bad acting, which is what we may be seeing in this election. So I think we need to look at absentees with the realization that there are trade-offs, that it is good to extend deadlines so that more people get to participate, but there is a real cost for that. And when Donald Trump makes this completely unfounded and unsupportable notion that he's going to cut off election on election night, that's not supportable. But on the other hand, the more ballots that are outstanding, the more time there is for mischief and uncertainty, and chaos is not in anyone's interest. So that pushing for the expanded absentee ballots that have now are kind of going to be the core issue of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, are the tipping point battleground states, really is going to set up a whole series of legal contests that probably aren't necessary. Since the US Postal Service a week ago it announced it was going to have sort of unacceptable rates of return of ballots, and Judge Sullivan here in the district kind of put them, exposed exactly what their delivery rates would be. It's been a remarkable outpouring in the different states, as reflected in the early voting numbers, about how people have managed to mobilize to get absentee ballots in by a deadline. And so I kind of think we need to look at absentee ballots as something for which we've got to have practical deadline dates that work. And the only other caveat I'd add is sort of my nightmare scenario for this election, which is whenever the deadline is, if it's election day, 3 days after, or 2 weeks after that, the day after the deadline in that particular state, lo and behold, the Postal Service comes in with a whole batch of ballots that are properly postmarked on election day, in which, oops, got misplaced. What's the court going to do? It's clearly after the deadline, but the mistake was clearly not the fault of the voters. And so that's a construct that even the Texas Supreme Court used in rejecting the case that you mentioned of Harris County and the 100,000 ballots.
So, and to be clear, there are the possibility of two different kinds of deadlines. In some states, the ballot must be received by election date, and in other states, it simply must be postmarked by election date, and then there is another deadline by which it must be received, which is supposed to allow for a little bit of time for the U.S. Postal Services to deliver it. And so it's possible to miss any of those. Those are the kinds of deadlines. And in some states, because of worries about too many ballots actually being validly cast, that is postmarked by election day. So it's not that anyone has the ability to vote after election day. You can't wait and vote your ballot after election day. At that point, certainly a postmark is going to be disqualified as not validly cast, but it's about when it's received and whether it is considered timely received for the purposes of being counted. Okay, Aaron, let's turn back to you. What are you seeing on absentee ballots?
I think for us, the issue with mail-in voting and with the ballot drop boxes was just that there needed to be the increased funding for election administration. And that was something that we urged Congress to do from the start of the pandemic, was to increase its funding to the Postal Service, because we wanted to ensure that the Postal Service would actually have the resources it needed to handle the increased number of mail-in ballots. We obviously know that that has not happened, but we are now encouraging people, and we have been over the past week or so, to just use the drop boxes to ensure that their ballots are actually counted and received, so that they don't run into many of the issues where the Postal Service does, there is the scenario that Ben mentioned where, they find it later and it is postmarked, but it isn't received by the election officials until afterwards, and kind of what the courts would do in that sort of situation. So we do think, just because the Postal Service hasn't received the right amount of funding for it, that it is just safer for people to use the ballot drop boxes. I mean, especially today, we're the day before the election. And it is kind of unfortunate, that we've seen the election administration come to this point at this time. But I think what's really at stake for us with the mail-in voting and with the ballot drop boxes is just the decreased access to the polls for people who really need it, for senior citizens, for people of color and low-income districts. Professor Kimberly mentioned earlier, that the fact that access to the polls is very dependent upon what zip code someone lives in. So people who live in certain zip codes are going to have longer wait times to vote in person. And those people really would benefit from mail-in voting options that function properly, and from access to ballot drop boxes. In Texas, they've limited their drop boxes to 1 per county. So in Harris County, where Houston is based, that's only 1 drop box for 4.7 million people. And you contrast that with King County in Washington, where Seattle is based, and there's 73 drop boxes for its 2.3 million residents. And I think that's something we need to kind of think about as we're dealing with the pandemic, and as we kind of progress in future elections, we should be making it easier for eligible voters to vote. And that is through access to drop-off ballot boxes and increasing access to it so that people have only a short distance to travel before they're able to drop off their ballot. And for people who are voting in person, properly socially distant, that they don't have to wait for hours in line at the polls. So I think we need to be focused on that and ensuring that people can vote and exercise their right to vote safely.
And I would note that because of the pandemic, Congress did appropriate, believe it was an extra $40 million, but it was $400 million. That was what was actually requested as what was thought was necessary to make it possible for people to participate in this election. So about 1/10 of the amount that was requested. And that is, there have been issues around drop boxes. One of them is that question of location in places like Texas, where in some places, the one drop box in the county is 100 miles away from some of the population centers in that county. So for those individuals, that's a 4-hour round trip drive, $50 in gas. And there are some states that say you can only drop off your own ballot. So then there's questions about whether someone else might drop off your ballot and whether that would be inappropriate. There have been questions around surveillance of drop boxes. In California, Orange County, the Republican Party put their own drop boxes up and labeled them as official drop boxes when in fact they're not official because they weren't set up by the election officials, and therefore they don't have the same bipartisan chain of custody for picking up any ballots that were delivered there and ensuring that they arrive at the registrar's office to be counted. Breaking that chain of custody also raises questions about whether those ballots were validly cast or might have been changed or destroyed en route from this private drop box. So, you know, Dropbox is also coming into the news for that reason. Kimberly Whaley, your thoughts on vote by mail and drop boxes?
Yeah, listen, this is what we're talking about right now. We can just name it as voter suppression, right? So, I mean, America was founded on a republic where primarily white male landowners could vote, and we're an opt-in system. We have to prove our eligibility to vote. I speak a lot in other parts of the world, on Zoom, of course, and people in other democracies are really stunned that it is so difficult for Americans to vote. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is access to the ballot. How hard should it be to vote? Some of us think it shouldn't be so difficult. You shouldn't have, in a pandemic, to drive that far. Efforts to limit access to drop boxes, efforts to attack the legitimacy of mail-in balloting. Those are all, tried and true ways of winning elections through keeping certain groups of people away from the polls rather than winning elections based on issues and policy. Now, the pandemic early on, having talked about this as others on the panel have, early on the question was, can we trust mail-in balloting? Is it fraudulent? Well, when some of these cases have gone to court, the courts have asked for the actual evidence of fraud. There is no evidence of fraud. So in that instance, the balance will strike in favor of access to the actual polls for the voter. Then we heard, of course, over the summer, Louis DeJoy, Postmaster General, cutting back on services. Aaron mentioned need for money. The HEROES Act's been pending since May, hasn't gotten past the Senate, would have had money for lots of things, COVID, but also more money for the post office, more money for running elections. So then the discussion was, okay, vote by mail is safe, but you should just vote by mail to avoid being infected. Then now tomorrow is the election, and we're hearing in the last few weeks, okay, don't use the mails, because even if you follow state law and put it in the mail in time, you have no control over your ballot. You, voter, could be disenfranchised by virtue of an entity, frankly, controlled by one of the candidates right now, Donald Trump, losing your ballot or delays in the mail, et cetera. And so put it in a drop box, and then we're hearing, well, drop boxes, there might not be access, or in Texas, drive-through drop boxes are invalid, et cetera. These are all, just very transparent efforts to make it harder for people to vote. And, some of us think that this shouldn't be where the battleground is. Congress could pass additional legislation like it has over the years. The motor voter registration law is a federal law, could pass legislation to make a lot of this easier for voters. HR number 1 was the first bill that was passed by the House of Representatives once the Democrats took over. It would have same-day registration. It would have automatic voter registration, other ways of easing access to the polls. But listen, we are still having a debate 230 years after the Republic was founded, after the 15th Amendment and formerly enslaved African-American males had access to the ballot. 100 years ago, women had access to the ballot. We are still having a debate in this country as to whether the, quote, right people should be able to exercise their constitutional right to vote. And, on the one hand, as I said earlier, I think it's a good thing that we're actually putting that on the table and talking about it, and people are becoming educated about the inequities of this. But on the other hand, it really is deeply, deeply troubling. And in your opening remarks, you mentioned the fact that there is no affirmative right to vote in the Constitution. And some of us who have read the Supreme Court's decisions around this do believe that it's because there isn't, as much as the court has held, that it's basically preservative of all other rights. If you can't actually exercise your right at the ballot box to decide who your leaders are, you can't have an impact on the issues that matter to you: healthcare, immigration, LGBTQT rights, climate change. On the other hand, the court has watered that down and essentially said, well, so long as you can claim there's some justification for election administration to justify unequal access or harder access to the ballot, we're not going to question that unless it's a, quote, undue burden. Of course, the originalists / textualists on the court should jump up and down and say that's not okay, it's not in the Constitution, but that's where we are. As Aaron mentioned, the silver lining again to all of this is the massive, massive outpouring. People are taking this into their own hands as if it was, their battle to fight. And that is where we are right now. It's an individual fight for your right. And hopefully we can see in my lifetime that not being the battleground anymore, and shifting it really to the policy issues of the candidates, not on whether certain people should be able to vote or not.
And hopefully we could all agree that it should be about issues, it should be about governing philosophy, and perhaps the qualifications of the candidates and their experience and ability to lead, and their vision, as opposed to trying to game who votes and who you're able to deny the vote as the strategy for winning the election. Let me turn to what happens on election day, and we know that there can be issues like equipment malfunction, long lines that require individuals to go to courts to get orders to extend the voting hours so that people who were standing in line before the end of the voting period actually get a chance to cast their votes. But there are also other kinds of issues that we come under this umbrella of voter intimidation. There is fears that people are going to show up at the polls armed with military-style assault weapons and signs, and doing things like taking down license plates numbers or demanding ID of individuals, things that frankly are actually against the law, but that they're hard to police. So what should individuals do if they face these kinds of voter intimidation? What kinds of things are the campaigns prepared to do? There's also legitimate poll watching, I should add, where representatives of the parties and campaigns can be observers of the process, as long as they don't insert themselves in improper fashion. So talk to us about what kinds of things you look to that occur, that people are thinking about in terms of voter protection, and making sure people are able to participate effectively on election day itself. And again, if we could start with Ben Ginsburg.
Well, both campaigns and both political parties will be exercising their legitimate rights under the laws of each state, which is to put poll watchers and observers into every polling place. I mean, that plays an incredibly important part in the ultimate validation of elections, that you do want poll watchers to be able to spot problematic behavior, instances of fraud if they see it, irregularities of some sort that can be brought up in an election contest after the election. That's part of the way we get legitimacy to the results, is that both parties do have the opportunity to observe everything that's happening in a polling place. So that's really to be celebrated. And you know, the both parties will have, I think, ample poll watchers in polling places and lots of overcaffeinated lawyers who are sure to raise problems as they occur in the polling place. It's also true, as you point out, that every state has provisions that sort of have a perimeter around a polling place. Voter intimidation is illegal in every state. And so there are, I think, a lot of eyes on this election. And if there are improper challenges that are outside of the grounds of a state law, you will have campaigns prepared to go to court to get whatever relief is appropriate in that situation. Sometimes it's extended polling hours. Sometimes it's law enforcement coming in to straighten out a situation. But I think one thing we can be assured of is ample representatives of campaigns and parties in the polling place and lawyers who know what their rights are under the law. And then you just hope that the fabric of that isn't stretched too thin because of unprecedented volume for all the reasons we talked about.
Okay, thank you. Aaron, your thoughts?
Thank you. I think we're seeing high volumes of calls around voter intimidation and voter suppression to our election protection hotline, and especially around driver activity around elections. So some people may have seen the caravans over the weekend. There were a lot of videos on Twitter of multiple vehicles expressing support for a presidential candidate engaging in conduct that could threaten public safety or intimidate voters. There were videos over the weekend of some voters with Trump flags on the back of their trucks following Biden-Harris campaign buses too, that were being widely shared. And we have some concerns about potential activity related to that, potentially blocking traffic or confronting voters at the polls or trying to block access to the polls for going in or out of the polling place, or potentially following people around a polling place. And it is important, as you noted and has been noted, that voter intimidation is a crime under federal law and every state's law. So voters who see this sort of activity should say something about it by reporting it to an official at their polling location. And they can also call or text 866-RVOTE, which is a nonpartisan line. So it's for people of any political affiliation if they want to report any sort of voter intimidation that they see at the polls happening. And when they call 866-RVOTE, we'll let them know the different tools that are at disposal in their states and who they need to notify. And that could lead to polling hours being extended at their polling location or who they need to report it to. It's important that voters shouldn't confront the individual if they are feeling threatened or intimidated directly by someone. But if they're in line to vote, they should just ask someone to hold their space in line so that they can report it to an official at their polling location. Because the poll watchers and polling station officials have been trained to handle these issues. So it's important that they know, like, as a first step. And it's important for voters to speak up because the voter suppression tactics that they're seeing may be happening at other polling locations and impacting thousands of voters in their state and in their community. And they may be too scared to say, and those voters may be too scared to say something about it. So it's just very important for people to kind of know their rights and know that they have a right to exercise their right to vote free of intimidation or any threats by anyone who's there. And we really want to, at the Lawyers Committee, we really want to make sure that everyone who is eligible to vote feels empowered to vote and knows the resources at their disposal so that they can safely vote.
And sometimes we just want to remember voting rights pioneers like John Lewis and screw up our moral courage and stand in line in face of whoever is trying to shout us down.
Mhm.
Kim Whaley, please, your thoughts.
Yeah, listen, law, as I tell my law students, comes down to incentives. So, so the question is, sure, there are these laws that make it illegal to intimidate voters. The question is, are they going to be enforced? Because without enforcement of laws, the laws are meaningless. And the example I always use is a speed limit. We will slow down if there's a hidden camera, but we'll blow through at 35 going 50 if we don't think we could get a ticket. So given that we're seeing, as Aaron indicated, increasing intimidation at the polls, given that the Supreme Court essentially gutted a key provision of the Voting Rights Act in 2013 that would have basically tamp down on voter suppression efforts, not necessarily bullying at the polls. But there's also a consent decree from the early 80s against one of the major political parties from a federal court that has also been lifted. We will see, and we're seeing more of it come back. The flip side, though, is it doesn't look like it's working. It doesn't look like the voter intimidation tactics are keeping voters from the polls. And Aaron had an excellent overview of what people can do, but I would just say use your common sense as well. Go to the polls with other people that you trust during daylight hours that you're comfortable. And if you're bringing a new voter, all the better. I do want to add something, though, again, back to sort of federal law. When we saw the president sort of intimidate or peaceful protesters in front of Lafayette Square, or at least federal agents through the Department of Justice at the president's behest. We saw violence in Lafayette Square towards peaceful protesters, towards members of the media. I think the last count was 8 or 9 people, and reporters actually lost an eye in one of those skirmishes. This is quite troubling, but one of the things that jumped out at me in that instance was the fact that there were law enforcement officials that did not have insignia indicating that they were actually law enforcement officials. And this is part of, I think, the concern, not just with violence potentially around the polls, but in general with this particular White House stoking his base to potentially use violence, because plainclothes vigilantes are not distinguishable under federal law. That's not the case at the state law level. In DC, for example, a law enforcement official by law has to identify who they are and who they answer to. And of course, that is absolutely fundamental to being able to hold our government accountable for wrongdoing, so that we actually know who they are. So unfortunately, I think that is another question, and we'll have to hope that legitimate law enforcement, if some of this stuff does amp up between now and the end of tomorrow, that legitimate law enforcement is poised to keep the peace in a way that respects constitutional rights and the access to the polls for legitimate voters.
Okay, as we get to our final question, there are some who have said, some analysts who've said, and if there's an overwhelming victory on the part of Vice President Biden, that may tamp down post-election litigation and questions about how even the electoral college process might be gamed to try to change the outcome through legislative maneuvering or gamesmanship, even should the question reach the floor of the Congress to have to use the secondary mechanisms that have never been used in the electoral college law about how a president would be selected. But if it's a very close election, particularly in a battleground state that could tip the election one way or the other, there is the possibility of the kind of litigation and uncertainty, perhaps even leading to protests and violence. In fact, we're seeing cities in America boarding up areas in order to protect property should there be unrest. Can I ask you just briefly what usually happens after the polls close? Do you think our system is prepared to handle these questions and to ultimately, if it's the will of the voters, have a peaceful transfer of government, or that we might end up in some of these scenarios testing how the Electoral College process works? And again, if we can, we'll start with Ben Ginsburg.
Well, I think the couple of points. First of all, is the process itself involves well-developed things that each state does to count its ballots. And it does begin on a very local level. And I think there's very little that will get in the way of that. In terms of your overall question about disruption or angst, it really depends on the margins of the vote totals. I mean, if it is a clear margin for one candidate or the other, then that cuts down on the post-election opportunities. But of course, if elections are close, in every state, a candidate has a right to check on recounts and contests what happens. And that can often take a long time. I mean, for example, in 2016, the Clinton campaign joined with recounts that Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, had filed in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And the date of their intervention in the court proceedings was, I believe, November 26th, but at any rate, several weeks after the election itself. So that's a pretty good example of a candidate realizing that there are processes under each state that they can pursue if they think the count's not correct. And perfectly legitimate to think that that would happen this time as well. Now, I mean, history is kind of an interesting guide on what will happen. To look at history, we'll get an answer on election night, not a final answer, but pretty clear trends as interpreted largely by the news media, but also the campaigns who can push back if they think it's wrong. Granted that there are an unusual volume of absentee ballots. Most states will count those, process them before the election, count them on election night. There are 3 states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, that do have a more prolongated process. And if they're the outcome determinative states, that may take a while. But I think the chances of it going to a recount or a contest are roughly 5.2%. And that's because we've had 57 presidential elections so far, and 3 of them have gone to recounts or contests. And so it's always a good idea to bet with history as opposed to against it. That still does leave more room than we've ever really contemplated before for the doomsday scenarios that I think really one way or another all revolve around there not being a clear winner of the electoral contest, the electoral college, either on December 8th, which is a safe harbor provision in the Electoral Count Act of 1887. Maybe it's December 14th when the electoral college slates meet in every state capital. Probably absolutely is January 6th, which is when the House of Representatives deals with the electoral college results. And, you know, the president and vice president's terms expire at noon on January 20th. So that's certainly a deadline. But I think that's kind of the framework to look at things in.
Thank you, Ben. And it's indicative of the high anxiety that does exist around this election, that so many of us know these dates now and know so much more about this electoral process than we did in the past. Aaron, your thoughts on this part of what will happen after Election Day?
I think that the American public is going to have to wait a bit, which I think will be kind of hard because, you know, there is a lot of anxiety surrounding the election. Millions of people have already cast their ballots. So I think people are anxiously awaiting a result. And if it is close in a lot of states, then it is likely that we won't know who won the election until a few days after. But I do think that the news organizations are going to be issuing their projections on election night or the day after to try to have a final result available to people. But I just hope that there's patience and counting and tabulating all of the votes to ensure that there isn't a flip-flop, which I think would kind of reduce trust that we can afford to lose in the election process. if news organizations were to call it a bit early beforehand. But it is normal, like a lot of states do not, their certification deadlines are after election day. For example, Delaware is just a couple of days after the election when they have to do their final tabulation. California has a month. So there is a range of time for states to do the final tabulation to certify the exact results. But I think the public is just used to hearing the news projections final decision on who won.
Thank you, Aaron. Kim, as you think about this question, could you tell us a little bit about this issue about deciding these election disputes according to state law, as opposed to when do they become federal questions, and the concerns about that even the court is becoming politicized, the confirmation of a recent justice, the expression of the president that he expects his judges to somehow be in his corner in these disputes. So what could these questions reach the Supreme Court? Could we be back in a case where instance in which the Supreme Court is deciding who will be president?
Sure. Well, I mean, I agree with Ben and many others who have said that this is really going to come down to the margins. Every state does have recount procedures or procedures to challenge the outcome of a vote, but it depends on the margins and it depends on the state. Some are much more lenient than others. And of course, all eyes are on not only Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, but also Florida and North Carolina. I'm not a sort of electoral counter, but people who look at those maps carefully will say, you know, if Biden wins those two states, or if Trump loses Florida, there's no path for the White House for Trump. So there are ways in those states that we could get a quick decision early, and that would be a good thing. You know, Ben mentioned December 8th. The part of the angst around December 8th is under that statute. If there isn't a count in a critical state, the legislature can meet and basically decide to cast their electoral votes in some other way. And there's some fear that that would happen and would basically co-opt the popular vote. So some think that's more of an issue than if it goes to the United States Supreme Court. With respect to the United States Supreme Court, we talked about a number of these principles already. No express right to vote in the Constitution. So most of this law is basically judicially made up law, which is okay. Every court does that. Conservative courts do it. Progressive leaning courts do it. Judges judge. We have something called the Purcell Principle, which says close to an election, you don't upset the rules. We're getting past that. This court, this more conservative leaning court, appears to be looking at if there is a close dispute, say in a swing state that goes to the Supreme Court, which I think is highly unlikely, as Ben indicated. But it looks like this court is looking to the source of the change to the law or the law that's being challenged. So for example, if the question is, can you count mail-in ballots that were postmarked by November 3rd after the date, the court might look to see, okay, what governmental entity made that change? If it's the actual state legislature, the conservative court is more likely to uphold it. If it were a federal judge, a state election official or Secretary of State, governor, or even a state court applying the state Supreme Court or the state constitution, that's where the court is less likely to defer to the change. So, you know, again, if we get back to
just even if in that case, what the state Supreme Court was saying, because you have a fundamental right to vote under the state constitution, we rule that we can change state law in order to vindicate your right to vote, right? That would be the basis for the state Supreme Court to have changed what the timing was. And then voters would have voted thinking that that was the framework that was going to be in operation.
Right, and that's trickier. I mean, basically, it comes down to the elections clause in the Constitution, which I'm not quoting verbatim, but essentially says that the legislatures will decide the process. So, a textualist would say legislature means legislature. It doesn't mean some other entity, and that's a federal constitutional principle, so that would supersede perhaps a state constitutional principle. Although in the instance where it's a state construing a state constitution, I think that would be a harder harder situation for the court to upend a state decision. But of course, Bush versus Gore, 537 votes in a single state put President Bush in office for 8 years because the Supreme Court decided to halt a recount under state law. So we have seen the Supreme Court intervene in basically what some would say are purely federalist or state law type disputes. And given how the not just Justice Barrett, but the last 3 justices were put on the court with their majority, the filibuster was gone, thanks in part to the Democrats who got rid of it for lower federal court judges, but then Mitch McConnell got rid of it for the Supreme Court. We have now a conservative majority who are on the court for life that really don't represent, or in the process didn't represent a single Democratic voter, because the Democrats in the Senate did not have any leverage whatsoever to manage the appointment of those 3 people. And of course, this particular Justice Barrett was put on the court with the president saying he would like to see the election resolved by the Supreme Court. So that's a classic conflict of interest. That's something for lawyers and ethicists and the court to decide. But Justice Barrett could decide in the interest of the legitimacy of the court and for purposes of protecting the integrity of the electoral process, which, as Ben said, is absolutely crucial, which is why we have all these auditing provisions and these checks and these these poll watchers, all these things that are so important so that we all buy into the system, we buy into the game. Some would say it would be better for her to recuse herself from a dispute where she could make a decision in favor of the president who, in the midst of an election, put her on the court.
Some critical issues facing our country, and I know the whole world is watching. I've done interviews with India, South Africa, Honduras, Venezuela, England. It's not just Americans who are watching and who think that there is a tremendous amount at stake in this election. And so if we want to promote the spread of democracy, we've got to live it here. And so I want to thank our distinguished panelists, Ben Ginsburg, Aaron Martin, and Kimberly Whaley. Thank you very much for being with us. I want to thank the Sine Institute, the Washington College of Law Program on Law and Government, the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies of the School of Public Affairs, and the School of Public Affairs Women in Politics Institute for hosting this, and our distinguished guests for taking time out on a super busy day when all eyes of the world are on this election, on the eve of Election Day. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for having me as your moderator. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.